In 1492, Christopher Columbus completed his voyage to America. That year marked a worldwide, life-changing moment for everyone. This expedition changed the world in ways of human exploitation and methods of production. The result of colonization and the numerous acts of genocide committed on Aboriginal people of Canada have created a devastating impact on the lives of Aboriginals. This has consequently impacted all aspects of Aboriginal life, including traditional roles, culture, health, generations of history and memories, and have ultimately been replaced by the oppressor's version. Regarding the disappearance of memory, Pierre Nora points out the exploitation effects of colonization as a key disruptor in areas that had little written history, but a wealth of collective memory and oral tradition. According to Paulo Freire, the individual must form themselves rather than begin formed from above. Taking responsibility of their own rehabilitation is important and needed, as this will allow Aboriginal people to have control over their own lives. Therefore, Aboriginal parents must claim the rights to direct the education of their children, and based on the treaties of the Indian Act, the Canadian federal government has a legal responsibility for funding Aboriginal education. All Aboriginal tribes, First Nation languages in North America, are a possible exception of Inuit in Kalaalleq Nunaat, Greenland, are seriously endangered and in need of rehabilitation. The active destruction of Aboriginal language in schools continue in many ways through government-imposed curriculum. Aboriginal schools are mandated to follow the English or French curriculum, and universities only offer teaching degrees in English or French. The impose of these dominating languages on Aboriginal people is identified as cultural genocide, which is the systematic destruction of Aboriginal traditions, Aboriginal values, Aboriginal language, Aboriginal culture, and Aboriginal identity. Systematically, these imposed English or French curriculum have much disproportionate academic achievement and engagement gap. Therefore, Aboriginal students are pushed out of schools and condemned to a life of poverty, addiction, incarceration, and suicide. Therefore, Aboriginal people must direct the education of their children by developing a suitable philosophy of education based on Aboriginal value adopted to modern living. These include discussions about new means of organizing, teaching, and learning, and challenges to and efforts of multiple practice in education, including pedagogy, curriculum, and assessment. In this hypothesis, Aboriginal people integrate distance education into Aboriginal schools, with this focus on Aboriginal tribal First Nation language and efforts to forge partnership with the community. Therefore, Aboriginals who identify as Mi'kmaq can learn to speak Mi'kmaq language, Mi'kmaq history, Mi'kmaq treaties, Mi'kmaq solidarity, and even that they are not at the school offering these lessons and near Mi'kmaq reservation. These are strategies that destabilize colonial powers and hopefully decolonize. Distance education. Distance education is a mode of instruction in which a physical and time separation between instructor and student normally exists, and thus one in which other means of curriculum delivery and two-way communication, including printed word, teleconference, computer-mediated communication, and other, are used to bridge barriers and meet the needs of students. Distance education methods have been used for a long time. It is considered that their first application to higher education has been initiated by the University of South Africa as early as 1946. However, it is also recognized that the foundation of British Open University in 1969 set the model of an integrated mix of pedagogic methods and multimedia technology that are nowadays considered an appropriate and credible system of distance education, operating at all levels of higher education and training. In Canada, many educational projects using broadband have been developed by and with First Nation. The Kiiway Ni Nuuk Internet High School is the first secondary school in Ontario to offer accredited courses using broadband internet. KIHS was created for youth living in small, isolated First Nation communities in Ontario who previously had to leave home to attend high school. Music Grid is an innovative project using broadband video communication for teaching music, including to peoples in Kankisulujuaq, northern Quebec, and Iqaluit, Nunavut. The Adult Education Department of Cree Schools Board teaches adult grading classes at the secondary level via video conference and through First Nations communities in North Quebec. There are 634 First Nation Inuit Métis communities, all with their own distinct culture and tradition, language, and regional dialects. Approximately 50% of Indigenous people in Canada live on reserves, 50% of reserves usually in urban areas. The education system as a whole reflects a segregation and stratification produced by interlinked structure in the caste, class, gender, geographic, and maintains the hegemony of ruling class, with today includes a new aspiring middle class and classes. These structures are at most influenced by globalization, which can be defined as the intensification of worldwide social relation, which links distant localities in such a way that local happenings are shaped by events occurring many miles away and vice versa. This brought forth a standardized assessment. International large-scale assessments have been an important element of global governments in education by joining up the measurements of educational performance and reinforcing the view of comparison, and this performance is important for economic and educational policy making. Standardized achievement tests, which are Canadian mandate assessments, are generally designed to assess the knowledge and understanding that a student has acquired in reading, language, spelling, and mathematics. These tests have become increasingly politicized, with schools ranked publicly on a single literacy test. The question is what we're trying to do in our schools. Because if the schools is learning the Mi'kmaq language, Mi'kmaq history, Mi'kmaq treaties, Mi'kmaq solidarity, then why force them to take a standardized assessment test? Of course, their kids are not going to do well because Mi'kmaq stuff is not represented in a standardized test that is used across Canada. There are all kinds of good reasons not to be following the standardized curriculum. Taking into account standardized tests are not different from intelligence tests. They are not different from personality tests. And mathematics for all of these different tests are exactly the same, as they have the same way of being evaluated. None of them have been normed for Native people. All of the standardized tests, classroom tests, are given and interpreted under the assumption that everybody has had the fair and comparable exposure to the information to the test. If students did not get a fair and comparable exposure to the material, then the interpretation of the results is unscrupulous. However, distance education is linked to an educational philosophy that is identified with student-centered learning. Open learning arrangements enable people to learn at the time, place, and pace which satisfy their correct circumstances and requirements. The emphasis is on the opening up opportunities by overcoming barriers that result from geographical isolation, personal or work commitments, or conversational courses structured which have often prevented people from gaining access to the training they needed. In the field of distance education, on one hand, students are able to complete curriculums to obtain a degree, a new diploma. Those students generally are engaged in the professional life and they are working already. Distance education is for them the only way to begin to pursue a high-level, full degree curriculum. So distance education appears as a second chance for education. For those students, assessments, examination, curriculum, and all of the constraints are those of a classical university are important. On the other hand, some students do want to acquire some new knowledge, a new qualifying related to their professional practice. They are only interested in either one matter or technically ability that they need for upgrading their competencies or enhancing their professional practice. They don't care much for obtaining a diploma after a full degree curriculum. The philosophy of original distance education is that It must recognize their culture is unique and must be kept alive for generations. Regardless of the delivery method chosen, education must include knowledge of their language, culture, history, values, heritage, and our spiritual beliefs. Where possible, education programs must be culturally relevant with curriculum designed, developed, and delivered by First Nation people. Some restrictions for this hypothesis are First Nations have many concerns about the well-being of their community members, and broadband internet is not a top priority for First Nation leaders when compared to other pressing priorities such as housing and economic development. Many First Nations do not fully comprehend the positive impact broadband could have in their communities. Collaborative effects will require involving all stakeholders, especially the members of community targeted for broadband infrastructure. Concerning that broadband is not a high priority, it goes without saying that broadband video communicates technology and also not a priority for those communities. The equipment needed for broadband video communication is an additional cost to having a computer and an internet connection. Moving beyond planning and developing a broadband infrastructure to implement high-end technologies such as video communication implications require significant investment in infrastructure, equipment, and maintenance. Very few Aboriginal communities have the resources necessary to use broadband video communication effectively. Across Canada, broadband infrastructure that can support video communication is located primarily in urban centers. The infrastructure is underdeveloped in rural and remote areas, which ultimately discriminates against the Aboriginal communities largely located in these areas. This plan of action provides the federal government the opportunity to uphold their treaty agreements with Aboriginal people in terms of education by participating and partnering with Aboriginal communities. This plan of action will then provide community with the education that can reinforce their Aboriginal identity and what gives Aboriginal children a strong sense of identity and with confidence in their personal worth and ability, thus liberating from their colonial power, and which is an underlying root cause of ill health among Aboriginal population. Treaties and inherent rights of education, which are in Section 35 of the Constitutional Act of 1982, recognize Aboriginal and treaty rights and affirms First Nation inherent rights of self-government, including the creation of laws and systems of provision of lifelong learning for First Nations population. Therefore, First Nations expect the Crown not only to recognize their jurisdictions of lifelong learning, but also to fulfill the constitutional treaty and international obligations to First Nations people by supporting the design and implementation of First Nations comprehensive learning system with adequate and sustainable resources. This hypothesis provides the federal government the opportunity to uphold their treaty agreements. Therefore, Aboriginal people across Canada want to control of their identity. First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people want to direct their own future, and deserve distance education courses and programs will benefit Aboriginal students and their communities. The cultural, social, political, and economical challenges in remote Aboriginal communities today are little different from those facing most of other communities. However, the culture, history, and environmental of remote Aboriginal communities are unique. The socio-economic challenges facing learning in remote communities are immense, while the solution of these challenges are few, slow to implement, and are often short-sighted. Distance education for remote Aboriginal communities can be part of the solution. To implement a successful distance education program, a remote Aboriginal community first step is to determine the program's barrier to success. The incorporation of culture and the environment experienced by students in remote Aboriginal communities is the curriculum and delivery of course is also essential for student success. Recognizing the qualities of culture and ensuring the curriculum incorporates the use of elders, including the opportunity to build relationship and respect the traditions and beliefs of Aboriginal students, will encourage student success. Also, prompt feedback to question assignments and exams is a best practice evidence that successful delivery situations. The feedback must be timely and also needs to be comprehensive. While accessing valuable learning opportunities, distance learning allows people to remain in their home communities and maintain close contact with families, support networks, and retain employment. This approach has an untold positive impact on the remote communities, as these students then become role models for younger generations. Students are also able to immediately apply their learning in the community, thus increasing social and economic impact of learning on the entire community. Consequently, the self-esteem and independence of the community grows while youth have access to options that they would have not otherwise have. Through proper research and effective strategies to determine the outcome of challenges to successfully distance education program and the implementation of practice, distance education will provide appropriate education opportunities to students in remote Aboriginal communities. In 1492, Christopher Columbus completed his voyage to America. That year marked a worldwide, life-changing moment for